This is a story about a man who considered himself observant. A man who could spot a 3% discrepancy in a quarterly report from across a boardroom table. A man who noticed when the wind in a market shifted before anyone else thought to look. A man who, for 11 years, never once wondered if the woman who had saved his mother's life was eating dinner off a cold kitchen floor in the dark. And one night, he came home early from a dinner that ended before dessert. He walked through his own front door. He found her. And what he did next changed both their lives completely. Pay attention to this one. It might change the way you look at the people around you. Daniel Whitfield was 42 years old and owned more of the city than most people will see in their lifetime. His company, which had started in a small office with second-hand furniture and 3 people who believed in him, had grown over 15 years of early mornings and late nights into a business with hundreds of employees across multiple cities. He had a house at the end of a wide, tree-lined street that looked exactly like the kind of house that belongs to a man who worked very hard and was rewarded very well. Nice cars, a good tailor, a calendar so packed that his assistant sometimes had to schedule him a 15-minute window just to eat lunch. He noticed everything that mattered to his business. A 3% swing in a quarterly report. A supplier padding an invoice. Shifts in the market that most people wouldn't register until weeks later. He was sharp, attentive, and genuinely good at reading the world around him. Except in his own house. Her name was Margaret Cole, and she had worked in his household for 15 years. She was 32 years old. She wore the same light blue uniform. She owned 4 of them, all washed and pressed, and she moved through that house with a kind of quiet purpose that made her easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Daniel had not been paying attention. He knew she was there. Of course he knew. He paid her salary every month, had for 15 years, never missed a payment. He knew her name. Knew she took her tea without sugar. Knew she kept the kitchen in a state of near-perfect order that his own mother had once called the most peaceful room in any house I have ever visited. But knowing someone is there and truly seeing them are 2 completely different things. And Daniel would learn this distinction too late, and the learning of it would cost him more than he expected. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand what Margaret had already given this family before any of it began. 6 years before that kitchen scene, Daniel's mother got sick. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she was the kind of woman who made every room warmer simply by being in it. She had lived with Daniel since his father passed, and in those years she had become the quiet center of the household. The person who remembered everyone's birthday. Who kept a tin of shortbread biscuits on the kitchen counter for anyone who needed a little sweetness. Who laughed easily, listened well, and never once made anyone feel small. Then the illness came. Slowly at first, tiredness, forgetting small things. Then days when she couldn't leave her bed. Then weeks when she needed someone beside her at all hours. Daniel did everything money could do. Best doctors, every treatment, every specialist, every piece of equipment. He flew in consultants from other cities and spared absolutely nothing. But there are things money cannot do. Money cannot sit beside someone at 3 in the morning when they are frightened and hold their hand and say, "I am right here. I am not going anywhere." Margaret did that for 2 full years. While Daniel kept his company running and his life moving forward the way it had to, Margaret gave herself completely to Eleanor's care. She brought warm soup and made sure she drank enough water. She read to her from the paperback novels lined up on the shelf by the old woman's window. She washed her hair and combed it gently and sang softly on the evenings when sleep wouldn't come. She sat through the hard nights and the harder mornings, and she did all of it without being asked twice, without complaint, without ever making Eleanor feel like a burden. When Eleanor whispered, "I'm scared, Margaret," Margaret would wrap both hands around the old woman's and say, "I know. But I'm here. You are not alone." And she meant every word. Eleanor always told Daniel that he should make sure Margaret never suffered if she died. Eleanor passed on a Tuesday morning in April. The whole house went quiet that day, the way houses do when something irreplaceable has left them. At the funeral, Daniel found Margaret standing alone beneath an oak tree at the edge of the cemetery. He walked over and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "She told me near the end that you were the best thing in her days. She called you her guardian angel." Margaret had looked down at her folded hands and said quietly, "She was easy to love, sir." Daniel had nodded. And standing there in the cool April air with his mother newly in the ground, he had made a silent promise to himself. He would always take care of this woman. He believed it when he made it. He believed he would keep it. That was 6 years ago. 14 months before that night in the kitchen, Daniel got married. Her name was Victoria, and the wedding had been the kind of event that cities remember for a season. Grand, glossy, photographed from every angle. Victoria was beautiful in the way certain things are beautiful, sharp, polished, impossible to ignore. She had an elegance about her that filled every room she entered, and when she smiled at Daniel on their wedding day, he had felt genuinely and completely like the luckiest man alive. He had not yet understood what lived behind that smile. Victoria had grown up in money, but not in warmth. Her family had been wealthy and cold, the kind of household where love was conditional and approval had to be earned fresh every morning. She had learned early that the world was a competition, that softness got you hurt, that closeness was a risk, and that the only safe way to move through life was to make sure you were always the most important person in any room. This had made her hard in ways she herself didn't fully see. From the very first week she moved into the house on Greenfield Drive, Victoria had noticed Margaret. Not with kindness. With a careful, measuring look, the look of someone calculating a threat. She watched the way Daniel sometimes lingered in the kitchen doorway to chat with Margaret about nothing in particular. The weekly shopping. A leak in the upstairs bathroom. A memory of his mother that a smell or a sound had brought back. She watched the easy familiarity of it, 15 years of small moments that Victoria could never share and could never erase. She asked Daniel about Margaret early on, casually, over dinner one evening. He told her everything. His mother's illness, Margaret's 2 years of devoted care, the funeral, what Eleanor had said at the end. Victoria listened with a still face and said, "How sweet." What she felt was something else entirely. And from that evening, the campaign began. Slowly, quietly, the way certain kinds of cruelty always begin, so gradually that by the time you realize what's happening, it has already become normal. The rules came first. 3 weeks after the wedding, while Daniel was away on a business trip, Victoria appeared in the kitchen one morning in a silk robe and announced that the staff would now eat separately. "This is a professional household," she said, in the tone of someone delivering company policy. "We should operate professionally." Margaret said, "Yes, ma'am," and nothing more. The separate meals Victoria arranged were small and thin. Plain rice. Watery stew. The kind of food that keeps you alive but not much more. On some days, when Victoria was in a particular mood, the tray simply didn't appear. No explanation, no one to ask, just absence where food should have been. Then came the chores. Victoria found new ones every day. Tasks that had never been part of Margaret's routine, added without discussion and expected without thanks. The house was large and Margaret was one person, and some evenings she finished work with her back aching, her feet swollen, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Then came the words. "You are too slow," said in front of the younger staff, Grace and Lily, who looked at the floor when it happened. "Do you even know what you are doing?" said with a look that landed like a slap. "You have been here 15 years, and this is the best you can manage," said quietly, privately, in the moments when no one else was close enough to hear. Margaret bore all of it without breaking. She was not someone who broke easily. Life had asked hard things of her before, and she had met them the same way she met everything, back straight, mouth shut, heart quietly doing what hearts do when they have no other choice. But she was tired. She was hungry. And some nights in the small room at the back of the house that had been hers for 15 years, she lay awake in the dark and thought about Eleanor and the way things used to be. And she thought about how strange it is that a person can give everything they have to a place and still end up feeling like they don't belong in it. It was a Thursday evening, warm and orange-skied, when Daniel came home early. The dinner had ended before dessert, a deal that hadn't gone the way anyone hoped, and Daniel had been in no mood to sit at a table making conversation with people pretending everything was fine. He said his polite goodbyes and drove home. Victoria was at a dinner of her own. Grace and Lily had finished their hours and gone to their quarters at the back of the property. The house was quiet. Daniel came through the front door, loosened his tie, and walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water before bed. He heard something before he reached the door. Not a loud sound. Barely a sound at all, really. More like the absence of something. A stillness that was too careful, too deliberate. The kind of stillness that only exists when someone is trying very hard not to be heard. He stepped into the kitchen. The room was mostly dark, lit only by the small light above the stove that was always left on at night. The refrigerator hummed. The curtain above the sink moved slightly in the draft from the window. And then he saw her. Margaret was tucked into the narrow gap beside the pantry door, a small shadowed space between the wall and the shelving, just wide enough for a person who wasn't very big. She was sitting on the tiled floor with her knees drawn up, her back against the wall, holding a plastic container in both hands. She was eating with a small fork. Slowly. Carefully. Like each bite was something she needed to make last. Her face was turned slightly away from him, but he could see even in the low light the wet shine on her cheek. She was crying. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway and did not move. He looked at the container in her hands. Cold rice. He could tell by the way it sat that it had come from the refrigerator, left over from dinner 2 nights before, the same dinner he had eaten at the dining table with Victoria while Margaret had served them and then gone back to the kitchen and eaten. Exactly? He realized, standing there in his own kitchen at night, that he did not know. He had never thought to ask. He looked at the floor she was sitting on. Cold tiles. No cushion, no comfort. He looked at her hands, rough, trembling slightly. Hands that had held his mother when his mother was dying. Hands that had cooked 1,000 meals in this kitchen. Hands that had never once reached toward him for help. Something moved in Daniel's chest. He had made a promise at his mother's grave. He had not kept it. He had not even been watching. He took one step into the kitchen, and the floorboard gave its familiar creak. The third one from the door, the one he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Margaret's head turned sharply. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her face went through several things in the space of a second. Surprise, then fear, then something that looked like the beginning of an apology. She started to rise, clutching the container against her chest as though she had been caught stealing something precious. Sir, I am sorry. I was just... Margaret. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She stopped. They stayed like that, Margaret half risen from the floor, Daniel in the doorway, the small light above the stove holding them both in its dim and honest glow. That was when they heard the front door open. Victoria's heels hit the marble of the entrance hall the way they always did. Sharp, deliberate, the sound of someone who wants to be heard before they're seen. A bag set on the hall table. The click of a light switch. Then her voice, cool and unhurried, calling from the entrance. Daniel, your car is in the driveway. Why didn't you tell me you were coming home early? Daniel looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the container still in her hands. Something crossed her face, not guilt exactly, but the practiced stillness of someone bracing for what comes next. She had worn that expression so many times in the past 14 months that the lines around her mouth had learned its shape. She moved toward the kitchen counter, quietly, to put the container down. She wasn't fast enough. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway. Still in her dinner clothes, hair smooth, small evening bag tucked under one arm. She looked the way she always looked after one of her social evenings. Polished, slightly electric, the way a person looks when they've spent several hours being admired and aren't quite ready to stop. Her eyes moved across the kitchen in a single sweep. Daniel by the door. The dim light. And Margaret standing at the counter with a plastic container of cold rice and a fork, caught so cleanly that there was nothing to say and nowhere to go. Something behind Victoria's eyes sharpened the way a cat sharpens when it spots something small trying to hide. What, she said slowly, is going on in here? The silence that followed had weight to it. Daniel felt it pressing on his shoulders. Victoria's gaze swung back to Margaret like a compass needle finding north. Margaret was eating leftovers, Daniel said. His voice was steady, but the words felt incomplete even as he said them. He was still, in some part of himself, trying to fully understand what he had walked into. Eating, Victoria repeated. The word came out the way certain people say stealing, not quite accusing, just shaped like it. From the family's refrigerator. Without permission. "Ma'am," Margaret began. "I have explained the rules," Victoria said, and her voice had gone very calm now, which was somehow worse than if she had raised it. "I have explained them clearly. Food in this household is not for staff to help themselves to. That is not how a professional house operates. We have been through this." "Victoria," Daniel said quietly. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Margaret, and the look in them was not anger. Not exactly. It was something colder and more deliberate, the satisfaction of a person who has been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. "You will leave that container where it is," Victoria said to Margaret. "And tomorrow morning we will have a conversation about whether someone who cannot follow simple instructions has a place in this household." The room was very quiet. Margaret gave a small, tight nod. The kind of nod a person gives when they've swallowed something that tasted like fire and are determined not to let anyone see it burn. "That will be all," Victoria said. Margaret turned and walked toward the kitchen door. She moved the way she always moved through this house now, carefully, taking up as little space as possible. She reached the door. "Margaret." She stopped. It was Daniel who had spoken. Victoria turned to look at him. A slow turn, the kind that carries a question inside it. Daniel was looking at the kitchen counter. At the plastic container sitting there under the small stove light. At the thin fork resting beside it. At the amount of rice left in the container. Not much. Less than a full cup. Cold food eaten on a cold floor in the dark by a woman who had held his dying mother's hand. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife. "What does she eat?" he said. Victoria's expression shifted slightly. A small recalibration. "I beg your pardon?" "Margaret, what does she eat every day?" Victoria gave a composed shrug. "The staff have their own meals arranged. I manage the household budget." "What does she eat, Victoria?" It wasn't a question anymore. The kitchen held its breath. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. Victoria said something about arrangements being appropriate. Daniel pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down. Not aggressively. Just in the way of someone who has decided they are not moving until they have a real answer. "Tell me what she ate today." "Yesterday." "The day before." A small silence. "I don't keep a record of." "Margaret." Daniel looked at her directly. "You can tell me. Like a promise." Margaret was still for another moment. Then she said, very simply, "There was no tray today, sir." "There was no tray yesterday." "The day before there was rice, not much. I kept the leftover for tonight." She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. No drama. No appeal for sympathy. Just the plain truth, offered carefully, like something she wasn't entirely sure she had the right to give. The plain truth landed in that kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel did not look at Victoria. Not yet. He kept his eyes on Margaret. "How long?" Margaret looked at her hands. Then back at him. "Since about 3 weeks after the wedding, sir." The sound Victoria made was not quite a laugh and not quite a scoff. "Daniel, this is absurd. She is being dramatic. She has her own meals. 3 weeks after the wedding." The words came out flat and careful, the way Daniel spoke in board meetings when someone presented a number that didn't add up. That was 13 months ago. He let the number sit there. 13 months. He thought about the past 13 months. The dinners he had eaten at his own table. The good food his kitchen had produced day after day. Proper meals, generous ingredients, plenty. He thought about Margaret moving through all of it, cooking it, serving it, clearing it away, going hungry while she did. He looked up at Victoria. She was watching him with that still, composed face she wore when she felt a situation slipping out of her hands and was working out how to take it back. "You need to understand," she began in the measured tone she used when she wanted to sound like the only adult in the room, "that running a household at this level requires structure. Boundaries between family and staff are—" "She is not staff." The words surprised even him a little, but they were true when they came out. "She has been in this house for 15 years. She nursed my mother for 2 of them. She sat with her when I couldn't be there. He stopped, pressed his hands flat on the table. When he continued, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. She is not staff. And whatever she is, she does not eat cold rice off a kitchen floor in the dark. Daniel pushed back his chair and stood up. He walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and looked inside. Then he took out a covered dish, leftover chicken from 2 nights before, rice, a container of stew, and he carried them to the microwave. Pressed the button. The microwave hummed. The numbers counted down. No one spoke. When it beeped, Daniel opened the door, took out the heated food, and carried it to the kitchen table. He set it down. He pulled out a chair. Then he looked at Margaret. "Sit down," he said. Margaret stared at him. "Please," he added. She sat. She sat the way a person sits when they're not sure they're allowed to, perched at the edge of the chair, back straight, hands in her lap, ready to stand again at a moment's notice. Daniel sat across from her. Victoria had not moved from where she was standing. The temperature of the room had changed in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. "Eat," Daniel said to Margaret. "A proper meal. At the table." Margaret looked at the food in front of her. Then she looked at Victoria. It was a brief look, half a second, but it carried everything. 15 months of rules and silence and shrunken meals and cold floors and the knowledge of exactly what it costs to step out of the place you've been pushed into. Then she looked back at Daniel, and she picked up the fork. Victoria did not leave the kitchen. She stood where she was, her evening bag still tucked under one arm, her eyes fixed on the back of Margaret's head with an expression that had moved past composure into something harder. Something with edges. She watched Margaret eat. And Margaret ate slowly at first, the way a person eats when they're being watched and every bite feels like a statement. But the food was warm. Genuinely warm. And her body had not had warmth in it for 2 days. After the first few forkfuls, something in her shoulders dropped. Just a fraction, just a millimeter. The way a person's body drops when it finally gets what it has been quietly begging for. Daniel sat across from her and said nothing. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them the way a person looks when they're doing arithmetic in their head, adding things up, checking the total, not liking what it comes to. Then Victoria set her evening bag on the counter with a small, sharp click. "I would like to speak to you privately," she said to Daniel. "You can speak here. Whatever you have to say to me, you can say it in this kitchen." Victoria's mouth pressed into a thin, precise line. She looked at Margaret again. And this time the look had shifted. It had stopped pretending. She walked to the kitchen table and pulled out the chair at the head, not a chair she normally used, but the chair that put her above both of them, looking down. The choice was not accidental. She sat. "I have tried," she began in her careful, reasonable voice, "to run this household with professionalism and proper standards. That requires clear boundaries. It requires the staff to understand their role and stay within it. Margaret has been here for 15 years, which I respect. But 15 years does not give anyone the right to eat whatever they like from the family's kitchen without." "She was eating leftovers," Daniel said. "Food that was going to be thrown away in the morning." "That is not the point." "Then tell me the point, Victoria. I'm listening very carefully." She stopped. And in that half-second gap before she found her next sentence, Daniel heard something he hadn't noticed before. Not words, just the sound of how she had spoken to Margaret all these months. The tone of it, the shape of it playing back in his memory. Small casual cruelties dressed up as policy. Hunger dressed up as professionalism. "The point," Victoria said, recovering, "is that this household has been operating without discipline, and I have been trying to correct that. If Margaret is unhappy with the arrangements, she's been going hungry." Daniel's voice did not rise. It got quieter, which was somehow much worse. "She just told me. She has no reason to lie. She never has lied. Not in 15 years. So let me ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He looked at his wife directly. "Did you tell the kitchen to skip her tray?" The silence that followed was 2 seconds long. 2 seconds is not a long time. But in a quiet kitchen at 10:47 at night, with a woman sitting at the table eating her first warm meal in 2 days, 2 seconds is long enough for everyone in the room to hear the answer that isn't being spoken. I adjusted the household arrangements according to my judgment. That is not what I asked. Daniel, I am not going to sit here and be interrogated in my own. Did you tell them to skip her tray? Victoria stood up. She stood the way a person stands when they've decided the conversation is over, even though the other person hasn't agreed. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. She picked up her evening bag. And she looked at Daniel with an expression that had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. She is a maid, Victoria said clearly, deliberately. Each word given its full weight. She is not family. She is not a friend. She is not your mother's nurse anymore, because your mother is gone. She is the help. And the sooner you remember that, the better this house will run. The words landed. Margaret did not move. She sat with her fork held still above the plate, her eyes down, her face very controlled. But Daniel saw her jaw tighten. He saw the small movement in her throat as she swallowed, not food, just the effort of sitting quietly while someone described her as though she were a piece of furniture that had been kept past its useful life. Daniel looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he said, "Get out of this kitchen." Victoria blinked. It was the first unguarded thing he had seen on her face all evening. "I am asking you to leave this kitchen right now." Still quiet, still even, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something final, the way the last page of a book is final. "Go upstairs. I will come and speak to you when Margaret has finished eating." Victoria looked at him, then at Margaret, then back at him. Something moved across her face that he couldn't read. Then she turned and walked out. Her heels crossed the entrance hall. The stairs creaked twice. Then went silent. The kitchen breathed. Daniel didn't speak for a while after that. He sat across from Margaret and let the silence be what it needed to be. He understood, in a dim and uncomfortable way, that the time for words hadn't quite arrived yet, that what Margaret needed right now was not an apology or an explanation. It was just this. To sit at a table in the light and eat without hiding. So he waited. She finished her meal slowly, the way she was careful and thoughtful about most things. When she was done, she set her fork down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the middle of the table. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Don't thank me for that." She looked up. "Don't thank me for feeding you in your own kitchen. In the house you've worked in for 15 years. That is not something you should have to thank anyone for." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Her expression was hard to read, not because she was hiding it, but because there were too many things in it at once. Gratitude, exhaustion, and something older and quieter behind both of those. The long accumulated weight of being overlooked by someone she had chosen to be loyal to. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "Not just the meals. All of it." "How long?" "Since the beginning, sir. The beginning of the marriage. And you never said anything to me." It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way a person says something when they're trying to understand their own failure, tracing the shape of the hole where something should have been. Margaret looked down at her hands. "You were happy, sir. You came home happy. After everything you went through with your mother, after all those years of grief, you came home happy. I did not want to be the one to take that from you." The pause. "And I thought perhaps it would get better. That she would settle. That once she felt more at home here, once she understood that I was not a threat to her." She stopped. A small, tired exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. "I kept thinking it would get better. It didn't." "No, sir." Daniel put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. When he took them away, he looked older than he had when he walked in the front door. "Tell me," he said. "All of it. Tell me everything." And Margaret, who had been quiet for 13 months, who had learned to make herself small and invisible and easy to overlook, who had swallowed 100 humiliations without letting a single one show, opened her mouth and began to talk. She started small, the way people always start when they've been holding something for a long time. Testing the ground carefully, making sure it will hold the weight before they put everything down on it. She told him about the first week, when Victoria had called her into the sitting room and explained in that smooth, reasonable voice that Margaret's informal relationship with Daniel was not appropriate for a married home. That going forward, Margaret was to speak to Daniel only when spoken to, only about household matters, and only when Victoria was not present. Daniel stared at her. She said that to you? In the first week? The 5th day? Then, keep going. She told him about the chores, the list that grew longer every week, written in Victoria's neat handwriting and left on the kitchen counter each Monday morning. Tasks added not because the house needed them done, but because they needed to be done by Margaret. Endless grinding designed not to clean a house but to exhaust a person. Scrubbing outdoor tiles by hand. Rewashing curtains that had been washed the week before. Polishing silverware that was never used and would never be checked because the checking was never the point. And you did all of it. It was my job, sir. Margaret. It was my job, she said again, gently but firmly. And he understood that she wasn't saying it to excuse herself or to excuse him. She was saying it because she had decided a long time ago that her dignity did not depend on whether anyone acknowledged it. She had done her work. She had kept her integrity. That belonged to her. No one could touch it. He nodded slowly. Go on. She told him about the words. This part took longer, not because there was more of it, though there was, but because words are harder to describe than actions. Actions are clean. You can say she did this on this day in this room. Words are different. Words seep into you. They come back at 3 in the morning when the house is dark. They sit with you while you're trying to sleep and whisper themselves back into your ear until you start to wonder, against your better judgment, whether any of them might be true. She told me I was stupid, Margaret said evenly without drama. Not once. Many times in different ways. Sometimes it was my work, that I had done something wrong or too slowly or not well enough. Sometimes it was just me, that I was too old for the work, that I dressed poorly and walked poorly and spoke poorly. The pause. One morning she told me that your mother must have had very low standards to have been cared for by someone like me. The kitchen went very still. Daniel felt something move through him that he did not try to name. It started in his chest and moved up into his jaw, and he pressed his teeth together once, hard, and breathed through it. She said that about my mother. Yes, sir. To your face. In the upstairs hallway. On a Wednesday morning. Grace and Lily were downstairs. It was just the two of us. He looked at the table. His hands were flat on it again, and he could see the tendons standing up under the skin of his knuckles. He thought about his mother, about the 2 years of illness and the long nights, and the way Eleanor Whitfield had sometimes looked at Margaret with a softness that Daniel had always noticed but never fully understood until right now. The way a person looks at someone who has saved them. Not from death, you cannot be saved from death. But from dying alone. From dying afraid. From the particular darkness of being sick and forgotten. His mother had not been forgotten. Because of Margaret. And Victoria had stood in the upstairs hallway and used Eleanor's name like a weapon. Daniel stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the dark garden, breathing slowly, the way a man breathes when he is deciding something and wants to be sure he is deciding it clearly and not just in anger. The flowers along the garden path, Margaret's idea years ago, planted one spring afternoon with Eleanor's approval and laughter, moved gently in the night wind. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around. I need you to tell me one more thing, he said. The meals being skipped, did Grace and Lily know? Margaret hesitated for just a moment. They knew they were not allowed to share their own meals with me. She told them, a breath. She told them that if she found out they had given me food, they would lose their positions. Daniel turned and walked out of the kitchen. He did not take the stairs slowly. He took them the way he took everything when a decision had been made, directly, without hesitation, all the way to the top. The bedroom door was closed. He opened it without knocking. Victoria was sitting at the vanity table removing her earrings. She looked at him in the mirror. Her face was composed, almost bored, the face of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes preparing for this conversation and had already decided how it would go. I was wondering when you would come up, she said. She told me everything. Victoria set one earring down on the tray, picked up the other. I'm sure she did. You threatened Grace and Lily. You told them they would lose their jobs if they gave Margaret food. I set standards for the household. You starved her. The word hit the room like a fist on a table. You systematically, deliberately starved a 32-year-old woman who has worked in this house since before you knew my name. You insulted my mother's memory. You built a list of rules designed to make her life unbearable. You did all of this in my house, with my money behind my back, for 13 months. Victoria turned from the mirror to face him directly. The composure was still there, but it had gone rigid, the way something goes rigid when it is working very hard not to break. You are taking the word of a maid over your own wife. I am taking the word of an honest woman over a dishonest one. The silence cracked. How dare you, Victoria said, and her voice had finally lost its smoothness. Something raw had come through underneath it, not remorse, not shame, but something more like fury at being seen. I have given this marriage everything. I have managed this household. I have hosted your colleagues. I have sat at your dinners and smiled at your clients. And you have been cruel to a good person. And you have been doing it for over a year. And you did not stop. His voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was the voice of a man who has made a complete calculation and arrived at a complete answer. I let it happen because I was not paying attention. I will have to carry that. But you chose this. Every single day you chose it. She is trying to come between us. She has never said a single word against you. He looked at his wife steadily. Not one. I asked her directly. Everything she told me tonight, I had to pull out of her word by word. She protected you. Even after everything you did, she was still trying to protect you. Because she did not want to hurt me. He paused. So don't tell me she is trying to come between us. You did that yourself. You did it the moment you looked at a woman who cared for my dying mother and decided she was a threat. Victoria stood up. Still straight, still polished, still beautiful, and none of it mattered at all right now. I want you to think very carefully about what you are doing. I have thought about it. Daniel, I want you to call your sister. Tonight. And go and stay with her while we figure out the next steps. Victoria understood what those words meant. He could see it in the way her face changed, the composure finally cracking, not into tears, but into something sharp and disbelieving. The expression of a person who has moved a piece on a board and watched the other player do something they never accounted for. You are ending this marriage, she said slowly, over a maid. I am ending this marriage, Daniel said, over who you are. She left at midnight. A bag packed quickly, badly, things pulled from drawers without much thought. Her sister answered the phone on the second ring. Whatever was said behind a closed door, and Daniel did not listen. He sat downstairs in the sitting room and waited. When he heard her come down the stairs, he stood. He did not try to stop her. He did not add anything to what had already been said. He stood in the sitting room doorway as she crossed the entrance hall and watched her go. The front door closed. The house went quiet. A different kind of quiet from before. Not the held breath quiet of a house waiting for something to happen, but the wide open quiet of a house that has just been relieved of something heavy. Margaret was still in the kitchen when he came back in. She had washed her plate and her fork and set them to dry beside the sink, because of course she had. She was standing at the counter, hands folded, unsure whether to go or stay or what any of this night meant for her. Daniel stood in the doorway. He looked at this woman, 32 years old, gray-haired, tired in every line of her body, standing in a kitchen she had kept running for 15 years. He thought about all the mornings she had been here before him, all the evenings she had stayed after he went to bed, all the hours in between that he had simply never thought to count. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. I owe you an apology. She shook her head slightly. Sir, you don't need to. I do. He came into the kitchen and stood a few feet from her, and he said it plainly, the way he wished more things in life could be said. I made you a promise at my mother's grave, and I broke it. I brought someone into this house who hurt you every single day for over a year, and I did not see it because I was not looking. That is on me. Not on you. On me. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, not quite crying yet, just bright. The way eyes get when something that has been locked up for a very long time is finally being let out into the air. Your mother used to say, she began softly, that the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. It is what they do when they find out they've made one. Daniel said nothing. I think, Margaret said quietly, she would be very proud of you tonight, sir. And that was the thing that broke him. Not the confrontation, not the anger, not the 13 months of his own failure laid out plainly before him. It was this, a quiet woman standing in his kitchen at midnight, tired and hungry-eyed, offering him his mother's words like a gift when he had not deserved one. He pressed one hand over his eyes. Stood like that for a moment. Then he took a breath, straightened and looked at her. Things are going to be different, he said. Starting tomorrow. Your salary, we are going to talk about what you are actually owed for 15 years of work. Not what I have been paying. What you are owed. And I am going to fix this house. Margaret nodded slowly, carefully, the way a person nods when they have learned not to believe in good things too quickly. And one more thing, Daniel said. He walked to the kitchen cupboard above the refrigerator, the one that held the good things, kept for guests and special occasions. He took down a tin of shortbread biscuits and set it on the counter. Then he looked at Margaret. My mother kept these, he said quietly, for anyone who needs a little sweetness. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. And then she wept, properly, finally, the way a person weeps when they have been holding it for 13 months and the holding is completely, entirely over. Not loud crying. Not dramatic crying. Just deep, shaking, honest tears. The kind that come from so far down that they clean everything on the way out. Here is what this story is really about. Not cruelty. Not conflict. Not even justice, though justice showed up eventually. It's about the people right in front of us that we have stopped truly seeing. Somewhere near you right now there is a person doing something faithful and thankless and good. They are not asking for a trophy. They are not asking to sit at the head of the table. They are simply asking, quietly without ever saying the words out loud, to be treated like they matter. Because they do. Don't be the person who only pays attention when it becomes a crisis. Be the one who asks the simple questions before it gets that far. Are you okay? Are you eating? Are you being treated well? Ask those questions. And when you ask, actually listen to the answer. The most faithful people in our lives are sometimes the ones we take for granted the longest. That truth cost Daniel a great deal to learn. It doesn't have to cost you the same. Look at the people around you. Really look. You never know whose whole world might change because you finally noticed them. Take care of each other.